Welcome everyone to our discussion tonight. I'm here with a panel of experts to talk about betrayal trauma and addiction, specifically sex addiction or pornography addiction, and all of the effects that the dynamics of the relationship and the ways that we can help and support. Our whole goal is to offer encouragement and hope and understanding. I'm a certified mentor. But more than that, I would call myself a collaborator. I love learning from the experts, the people who have had extensive education and experience, facilitate this singles group. And in this group, we have these people, the experts. We have therapists and life coaches, and we have some college professors, public speakers, and authors. Anyway, anyone who would support the singles, that some of those experts are also married. So it's just in there to support the singles. But I believe that with healthy attachments and connections and building trust, that takes looking at ourselves, and that we can talk about that, different ways of healing and finding hope. But you may be in different places. Those of you who are listening to this, it may be in a place where you still need to be validated for what you're feeling. And so first question that came up to me that was brought up is that they would love for you to define, and I will direct this to Blue first, if you don't mind, Blue.
Yeah.
Define what is addiction? How do you how do they know if it's an addiction? Some are saying it's just a compulsion, and I don't have an addiction.
Yeah. It's a great question. Addiction is simply a pattern of compulsive behaviors that really do kind of start to have very strong like issues in the degrees of social lives, occupation, maybe legal, and it has consequences. And despite those negative consequences, they continue on. And so, the DSM has changed a little bit from dependence and abuse, but I still kind of refer to that quite a bit because there's a huge difference between someone that gets dependent on something versus, someone that abuses a substance or a behavior. And it is kind of an interesting, I guess, paradigm that we're in right now where some of the sexual addiction doesn't quite register yet the DSM. It needs to, because it's very prevalent. But when you look at the cause of addiction, I'm a firm believer that it's all stems from some place in trauma. And so that's why I'm eager to hear from our panelists today too, because there's going to be a lot of light shed on so many different aspects of this. But to simplify it down to its Cliff Notes version, I would say it's a pattern of compulsive behaviors. And, despite those negative consequences, it continues and it increases. The secrecy, the gaslighting, all that stuff kind of floods in because at the core of the person who's battling the addiction, there's a core issue in there that they haven't identified yet, that they're afraid to get to, and that's where all of you panelists and all of us come in to help them discover that. I believe that addiction can be cured. I think with the right principles and with the right set of team like we've got assembled here. I'm a firm believer it can be overcome. I've seen it. So excited to be here and to participate in this way.
Very good. Thank you. So yes, I've mentioned a little bit that Coach Robinson is, it's for general addiction. His specialty is addiction as a broad topic. So anything that has to do with how addiction works. And then Kathy, I wanted to defer to Kathy if there's anything that is specific to sex addiction that might be any different than what we say about general. What I've heard is that that the pornography or the sex addiction is the substance, if you will. That's what they turn to, and instead of the drugs or the alcohol. That's how I've seen it. So maybe the behaviors might be the same. I'm not sure. How do you speak to that? Is it?
Thanks, Sherry. So it's interesting. It was just 2011 that the body that decides what goes into the diagnostic manual and what is considered an addiction, in just 10 years ago, they finally included behavioral addictions. It used to be, hey, you can get addicted to a substance, we get that. But just in the short past, they said, hey, wait a minute, we cannot deny the fact that individuals get addicted to behaviors. Gambling is a behavioral addiction.
Mm.
And even though that's in the DSM, anyway, yes, it's getting addicted to a specific type of sexual behavior. So you might think, well, I've never gone to a prostitute. You know, I can't go to 12-step groups because those guys are talking about going to I would never do that. Probably true. Maybe that's not your arousal type. So that would never interest you to do that particular form of sexually acting out. So there's a very well-researched different forms of specific sexual behaviors that people act out on, and the reasons for that. But yeah, sexual addiction does at some level involve a sexual act, but how it involves a sexual act is quite fascinating to me. So I'll just give you a quick example. Somebody that's an exhibitionist, you know, the old school world was flasher. Well, that's not really sexual, right? It's like, we're okay, I showed my genitals. But what their trigger is fear. They want and need to see fear in your eyes. So if one of my clients might flash somebody and you don't get afraid, they'll go around and 60, 70, 80 people they'll flash that day to get that hit from your fear. Mm. So there's a lot of different reasons that people act out sexually. And now I'll stop.
Oh, no, that's good. That's really good. No, that's good to define, because, and I like that you pointed out that it's not necessarily noticed by all. Maybe all therapists might not even recognize it as even an addiction. They might just say it's not. Well, that's good. I'm glad you pointed that out. So, Kathy, here are some other questions that I know your area of expertise are the neurological effects. Like, tell us about the physiological effects of addiction, and maybe Blue can speak to that as well.
You know what?
Brain. What does it do in the brain? What happens?
One of the things that's so fascinating to me, just from a Christian perspective, scientists keep proving the Christian knowledge, I think, to be accurate. I'll give you an example. What happens with addiction is it shrinks our dopamine receptors, and we can see that. I could show you a picture of those actually shrunken. So what happens is they get overused, where dopamines are what scientists call our joy receptors. That's what scientists call it. Mm. And to get that dopamine in, it starts to shrink. So we crave that hit, but we can't get that same big hit because they're shrunk. So think about it. If you imagine, and maybe we shouldn't, but let's just maybe for the moment imagine a council that the adversary got together and he said, look, guys, we got to go after him. We got to go after him hard, and we got to hit their brain. What do you guys think? With laser-like precision, the adversary went after what scientists call our joy receptors. Men are that they might have joy. What did he go after? Our joy receptors.
Wow, I like that, insightful. That makes a lot of sense too. Wow.
Yeah.
So now, Marnie, well, let me see. If we're jumping ahead too fast, I don't want to jump ahead too fast. Does anyone else have anything that they want to say about addiction, or?
I would just add to what she said with that. I mean, specifically, I was in a leadership position in my church for 5 years, and I got to lead this little ward for a little while. And that was the number one issue that I dealt with more so than anything, was pornography addiction. And the problem I saw with it too is that because it's so natural, it is the most difficult thing to overcome in any addiction. I mean, you're talking chemical dependency is like a walk in the park compared to this because of that. And so she's absolutely right. It shrinks that dopamine receptor down, and nothing brings joy. With the guilt and the shame that's attached to that, it really does wreak havoc. So yeah, she's right. The adversary knew exactly what he was doing to tarnish, that aspect, because it is a plague. So I agree 100%.
I'm so glad you said that. And what it makes me think of is if you do the reverse cycle of our actions come from our feelings, and our feelings are motivated by our thoughts. So anything that we put into our minds, is going to create the thoughts and the actions and the feelings. Anyway, so that's what I thought about. That's why he would go there. Yeah, Holly.
If I can add something too.
Yes.
Well, I was just kind of thinking about the sexual addiction, and we all have different, as Kathy was saying, different arousal templates. And we're all trying to get a need met. Something that's different about sex addiction that might be different against maybe drugs and alcohol and other types is that we're actually not trying to take the sex away, right? It's something that we're actually want to be a healthy part. So there's managing that, is that it's not about going dry. To have a sexual health, a sexual healthy sexuality isn't about cutting out sex from your life, but using it in a healthy way that, through positive coping skills and using it to connect. So it's a little bit different than some of the ones where we just take it away.
I'm glad you said that. Someone asked me when I told them that I worked for a therapist that specialized in sex addiction. They said, sex addiction. He was just shocked. And he said, so how do they cure that? Sobriety? Like, no, does that mean abstinence? Is that how you cure it? So anyway, I said, no, they cure it with connection is my answer. Anyway.
Well, I think it's more than just connection to others. It's also connection to self, connection to a higher power. So it's being able to connect with all of those, not just that one person.
Oh, okay. That's very good. Okay. So,
I'll touch base on that too. One thing I've noticed is with my own clients and stuff that I've worked with, specifically with married couples, is that there's these 3 stages. And the problem I'm seeing is that we have a real hard time understanding how to love someone and then allowing them to love us back. So, and what I've noticed is that when you first, have an initial attraction and you're falling in love, that's a great stage, right? I mean, you remember what that was like, on the telephone all night, your battery goes dead and you just want to be with that person all the time. Well, eventually, that's going to wear off. Masks come off, realities kind of kick in, maybe marriages happen. And eventually, I think everyone goes through what I would say with the stage 2, falling out of love. It's kind of like, wait a minute, I'm aligning myself with this person and there's all these kind of like hidden things I didn't know of. And that's a real hard thing. Now you can get through this. And that's the 3rd stage, learning how to love and learning how to be loved. But what I've noticed is that we're having a real hard time getting there because we've kind of forgotten what that even is. So I love what she's saying about making sure that these aren't just abstinent-based conversations. They have to be very emotionally detailed, which, let's face it, men, we have a really hard time opening up to that side of us. It's confusing. Many times we have, people in our lives, maybe even like parents, that may not have shown how to love and be loved. And so there's such a chaotic experience to be dealt with that. And what I've noticed is that we're struggling with what authentic love means for ourselves and to allow someone else to love us as we love them. It is turbulent.
Yeah, that is so true. The loved one, what is the loved one's experience? And all of you can speak to this. Kathy, I can quote Kathy. She, when we first talked, she said, the way that she thought about betrayal trauma is you can't be betrayed until you have trusted. So that means that you have it in you to trust, right? And it's learning how to trust again. But what is it that breaks the trust? Marnie, anything that you have to say about defining the effects, the characteristics of the spouse? What happens when they learn of their spouse's behaviors?
So I feel like when I found everything out, it really was the shattered world. Like everything in my life and the way that I saw it wasn't true. I saw that there was this other life. I'd been married for 21 years to someone who had his acting out had evolved to an extremity of prostitutes, strippers. I hadn't known about anything really with pornography. Looking back now, I can see being educated, but I only caught pornography the first year in our marriage of the 21 years. So when I caught his work phone, and also he was that spiritual, Christ-like leader person that even when things didn't seem right, I believed who he showed me who he was. And I would even kind of make excuses for him in ways because it had to be true. I convinced myself of his truths in a lot of ways, the whole gaslighting, things like that. Anyway, so for me, the actual discovery, which we refer to as the D-Day, was when it ultimately just fell apart. And I pulled on a string that just kept going back farther and farther and farther and farther back. And the most difficult part, I think, for me in that experience was the lack of trust that I had in myself. I am a naturally trusting person, but everybody's bank account of trust, if you want to call it that, was zero. And it was easy to gain back for, family and friends, specific people. But for myself, I feel like I am almost the one that took the longest because I didn't trust my own judgment. And I have a college degree. I'm educated and outgoing, and like, I will address things. I'm not willing to do that. And so I couldn't understand how I didn't see. I had been around family members who are alcoholics, involved with drugs. So for me to, again, be living with someone who was involved with this, but I didn't believe that they could be, I just thought, what was wrong with me? I'm so dumb. And then to follow up, so many people would be like, did you really not know? Or how did you really not know? And again, it goes back to what Kathy's saying. Like, I really did trust so much of what he was. So, there's so much of the PTSD symptoms that kind of come along with that, where I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. My mind was almost like it was hijacked. I would be driving and not remember where I was because I was literally trying to piece conversations and timelines of where I was and what was really happening. And then, just like the nightmares, there was a long list for me that really took a long time, and not even really being able to be the mom that I needed to be for my kids because I was so distracted in my new life and what is my marriage and where are we going. And I had him move out, and with the intent to have him move back in, but it just, again, pulling on things that he continued his behavior and fighting for someone who's not fighting for you, that he just really wanted, in my experience, wanted it to go back to normal. But to me, I now knew, and it wasn't normal. And in ways it was almost more hurtful that he knew I knew and would still go act out.
Yeah, that is, thank you for sharing that, Marnie. It takes a lot of courage to share that. There are a lot of women I know that experience that are not as not ready to share it publicly. So I know that you speak to a lot of women. There are other experiences too, and anyone that wants to share can definitely share. But I know that there are different levels. Maybe I would even tell me, correct me if I'm wrong with this. You all know a bit more than I do. Are there different levels of the trauma, betrayal trauma? I wonder I can tell from your story why that would be considered trauma, because it was such a shock. I would say trauma might be something that's out of your expectation, or maybe. But how would you, any of you betrayal trauma specialists, how would you describe that to a client who's new to this? What does the betrayal trauma mean? Why do you call it trauma? Does anyone want to speak to that, Raquel? We haven't given you too much chance to talk, and I know you have some great things to say about this too, if you want to.
Sure. I was reading something last night that kind of stood out along these lines of just, and it was an important part of my own healing, but just understanding the trauma that comes from being betrayed by the person that you trust the most, along the lines of what Kathy shared. Betrayal from someone who you're supposed to, who's supposed to provide safety and security, and that's where you experience, betrayal. So
yeah,
if that helps.
Yes, Marnie.
And I would say for me, in my experience, that I don't know that I can even compare the trauma or the level of trauma, because when I found pornography on the computer the first year into our marriage, I mean, this is when the internet was so new and I didn't even know what I was looking for, and it happened to just kind of come my way. But I felt like he had cheated on me then. In that moment, in that level, that was really difficult. And so then fast forward now, prostitutes and strippers like that, I can't say that discovery came across like even harsher or anything. I think in some ways, because of some of the patterns over the years of getting to that point, feeling like things were off, but I couldn't pinpoint it, actually became a relief to me that I wasn't crazy. And so to say that that we like to compare what the trauma, and I know that after that first initial D-Day, I had several like discoveries that followed that in some ways became more traumatic. Like when I found out he'd had an affair earlier in our marriage, and we've been totally divorced by this point, that it came forward, and it was just, it knocked me out. Like another thing, you know, I thought I couldn't hear anything new. So anyway, that's my thought for me. But it is when it's someone, as Raquel was talking about, that you're supposed to lean on and trust. And that's part of the trauma, is that this was supposed to be my person. And so, but this is the person that's hurting me. And I don't know who to go to when I'm hurting, because it's supposed to be him, but he's the one that's hurting me. And I don't really trust right now. And I don't, anyway, so that's that. I think Holly, you had something you were going to say too.
Yeah.
But you know, Peter Levine says that trauma is just anything that our system can't handle or process, right? So whether we're talking about little trauma, big trauma, luckily we don't have to define it, right? You know, and we all experience it differently. You know, kind of what Marnie was saying, it can be the same experience, can be little or big for someone, but how's our nervous system, how's our body taking that in? And so luckily, in order to heal or in order to work on trauma, we don't have to say, you know, whether this is a big or little trauma, we don't really need to define it, I think, but it's more just, we're going to kind of treat them the same way.
Thank you for that clarification. It's true. I can see how what you're saying, that there's not levels. Loss is loss. Betrayal is betrayal. No matter how it's coming, it's going to still hurt. And so, there's no way for anyone to decide how heavy or light that person's trauma is. It's just not, it just needs to be addressed and supported. That's awesome.
You know, another interesting thing about betrayal trauma, it actually has the ability to cause a change in your heart physically. It's called broken heart syndrome. But the clinical name is Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, and it's because they discovered it in Japan in the 1990s, and your heart takes the shape of the octopus trap temporarily.
Wow.
Most people survive it, a very high percentage. I can't remember the percentage, but it's broken heart syndrome. I did a little thing on this before, but the reason I bring that up is that nobody tells you how visceral the pain is. The pain is in at a cellular level, and your heart actually breaks physically. It's not a metaphor. It's not when the spouse is saying my heart feels like it's broken. It's like it is physically for a time, and certainly healing comes, but that can be the impact on somebody's physiology, which is pretty significant, obviously.
Yes, thank you. There are a few men on this call. One I know is here for supporting his girlfriend who has gone through this. So he's grateful to be here and hear these things. And then one of the participants commented that he's very grateful to you, Marnie, for sharing your story. It's really good to hear the insights that, you know, how are the women, what is their experience, or the men, that men and women both experience betrayal trauma. It's not just gender specific. I'm curious, Coach Blue, so are you also supportive of spouses in your program? So they just both come together for your support groups? That's what I was wondering about. So side by side, you just come to understand addiction and understand supporting the family. And okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, not just the 501c3, I also do my private practice here as well. So I do a lot of family therapy called couples therapy. And we kind of obviously do a lot of like the sports analogies and whatnot. We talk about building and strengthening your home team. You've got to have a strong home team. And that home team is kind of like, you know, the couple, and then the players, the kids, everybody has their roles and responsibilities. And you want it to be operating like a dynasty team, right? You don't let things come into your home that are going to tarnish, you know, your home court record. And so what I've noticed, and we don't separate them. I don't do like Al-Anon and AA. We bring them together so they can learn from each other. And it gets to some interesting places because there has to be complete honesty. And that's one of the things that is so rough with this. Trust is something that, you know, we've talked a lot about tonight. And what I kind of do is trust is not earned. It's a gift. And we teach the premise of like, you've got to be delicate with who you gift that trust to, because you can earn tons of trust, but then one thing goes wrong and you lose the whole battle. So we teach about like, hey, be cautious who you give your trust to, and know that if it's tarnished, you can take it back, and it's too fragile for you right now. And I think it comes in increments, but yeah, we do both together. And there's been times when, unfortunately it's not going to work. Like I said, even when I was, serving in my church, there were times when I had to counsel separation and divorce, and it got me in a little hot water with some other people that were higher than me. But I'm like, look, this person's not wanting to change. Their heart is at war, and this isn't going to work for her. And so it's a delicate balance, but it's a huge thing too. And I've noticed, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, I'm not a big one on this, the fact that we call a member in this situation a victim, it burns a little bit, because my mother went through this. I mean, my mother was married when she was 14, so she was a kid having kids, and married and divorced 8 times, and put us kids through just garbage. And so I watched her single life and the way that she was traumatized by husband after boyfriend after husband. Subsequently, my sisters went down that same pattern. And so, what if I don't mind me asking a question, I'd love to ask some of you, how do you get your feet underneath you to stand up? Because I've watched so many women in my life, like my mother, my sisters, never stand up after that. They've had 4 or 5 divorces, each of them. And it's been rough to kind of see this. And I take myself out there, and I get married one time, and I'm like, we're going on 22 years. I'm like, I don't want all that stuff. But I'm curious, how do we move out of that victim stance? Because it burns me to have people call themselves that. And I get it. I understand it, but none of you are victims. Like, you guys they're strong. You're strong individuals. And so I'm curious how you get your feet back under you once it's exposed, once it's understood, because I never got to see that in my own realm, if that makes sense.
Yes. Who wants to address that one? That's all of you could probably address it. Everyone can give their 2 cents.
Blue, there's such good research on post-traumatic growth. And I think that trauma is kind of like, it seems to me like it's a magnet. You get something happens, and it just, all of your trauma just magnetizes to it, right? But post-traumatic growth is a real thing. We see it all the time. And people, absolutely, if you're living on this earth, you have been victimized at some point in your life, but to stay in that victim stance won't help you heal. It won't help you grow. And so you can, no matter what, when I turned 40 and my life just blew up like nothing I saw coming. Yeah, the pain is real, and you have to keep choosing in. It's not a moment, for me at least, it's not a moment where I choose to, no, it's crawling through days, and then possibly, standing up on a couple before you trip and fall down again, and then get going. But that growth mindset, that this is going to be a challenge rather than this happened to me and I'm out, makes all the difference.
That's awesome. Yeah, does anyone else want to speak to that? Holly, I can see you might have something.
I always have something.
Good. If you want to share.
I think kind of what they're saying is, yeah, it's okay to say I have been victimized, right? Like, I have been hurt. But as Kathy was saying, I always, that doesn't have to be where we stay. We can be tender, that we can be gentle with that, we can be empathetic. I always tell my women when they're in the first days of group, they're angry that they're there. They're like, I don't want to be here. I shouldn't have to be paying this money. I shouldn't have to be sharing my story. I didn't put us here. So it comes in with a lot of anger. And the one thing that, when I hear the women leaving on the other side is they say, I came in here because my husband looked at pornography or because he had an affair, and I'm leaving knowing who I am. I'm leaving knowing my strengths. I'm leaving knowing how to process my emotions. I'm learning. I've been able to get through my own trauma. And so it never fails. They come in because of one thing and they're leaving, a totally different person. And that's where we kind of see that growth that Kathy, I went to a symposium on the post-traumatic growth. And Elizabeth Smart was speaking, right? She said, I never would wish this on my worst enemy. We all know what, hers is much bigger if we're measuring trauma, right? But she said, I never would wish this on my worst enemy. But she said, because I went through this moment of time, right? This pain, this this moment of your world comes crashing down. We can all remember where we were, right? The world starts crashing down. Because she said, because I went through this, now I'm a stronger person. I'm more empathetic. I do things that I never would have done before. I know who I am, right? So it can push us to this amazing place if we kind of keep rowing, if we keep trying and it's foggy and it's day by day, but it can be a blessing, even though we're never probably grateful for the action.
That's good. And Blue, something I want to say something to interject, and then Marnie for sure. Something that I've learned and what I talk to of the people in our group are the name of the group is Thriving Singles Community. And so anyone that comes in there are people who are ready to, they're doing the work and they're wanting to thrive regardless of their circumstances. And the reason why I thought to do this group is that my healing came when I decided, when I realized that I was victim, I was hurting, and everyone was validating me in my pain. Anyone that I would tell the story to, I didn't tell a lot, but anyone that I did, I was validated in my pain, and I could have stayed there forever. It was a comfort thing for me. And I think that's really common. But I did hear from one of the self-help personal development courses. They said, you can stay here or you can see how it's serving you, but being outside of validation is where you're going to find your healing. Brilliant. And look at yourself and see what Holly was saying, what can I do to make a difference now? What now? And so in this group, that's what I say is, I'll validate you to the moon and back, but then I want to say, okay, now what? Now, what is your next step? So I think what your experience with your mom and maybe your sisters is that it's more common to just say, I'm a victim and I'm in a rut, and men suck. I'm not going to have anything to do with men for as long as I live. Or you can say, there are other options out there. And anyway, I can learn from this and
brilliant. Thank you.
Marnie.
I was going to say, even a different twist on that was, I didn't think I had been in an abusive marriage. For me, I was already through the divorce process when I was in a therapy session, and I declared that he was not abusive. There was no yelling or even arguing. And then I continued to go through as she stopped me with all the ways he was so emotionally abusive, financially abusive, spiritually abusive, sexually abusive. And I remember getting off that call and just crying in bed, and like, I could not believe or accept even for myself that I was a victim of abuse, that even as I came to understand what that looked like and what that was. And then even for my family, who again, my dad's a judge, like he deals with people, he should feel like, and my brother, like, to recognize these kind of things, and that they themselves didn't either, And so I think that was where it took me to that space of, wow, I was a victim, but I don't choose to stay here. Kind of, we talked about, like, I'm going to have a tent and I'm going to fill it and I'm going to work through it, but I'm not going to build a log cabin here. And I want to move on so I can say that I have been victimized, and I understand it and I recognize it, because I still have to interact with this person who still can be so emotionally abusive, but now I get to recognize it. And even though I'm disappointed at times that I revert back to my role that I was in our marriage, and taking it and then having my moments of like, no, I know exactly what he's doing and I am not doing this again, And so it has taken that practice of, again, gaining my own confidence and working through to recognize, like, I was absolutely victimized and I didn't even know, but I'm moving through, and I want to choose different and educate myself so I can be more aware, even in the redating and being out and interacting with other people. It's interesting how you start to recognize, and teenagers in Darvo, that's amazing. Don't we all see that? We're like, wait, I know what that is.
Yes. So who wants to answer the questions about dating? You guys all are leading us just this conversation beautifully. This is the next thing I want to talk about is, so that's what I would say is, say, what now? Now, what kind of advice can we give to those who are now wanting to date? Well, just all about boundaries and dating. All about what does recovery look like? I actually heard, I'll tell you this before we hear your answers. when I worked for Dr. Red, there were a few clients who were telling me, I will never date a man who looks at pornography or who has looked at pornography. If he's ever looked at it, I'm not going to date him. And I asked Dr. Red, what is his 2 cents on that? And what is your advice for someone who says that? And he said, definitely you want to understand, where they are in their recovery. But he said, if you are looking for someone who is a partner that is loyal and who is high integrity and firmly, solidly committed to the relationship, it would not be a bad idea to date someone who has been there, someone who is doing the work. So who wants to talk about what does recovery look like? What do you look for if you're dating? Who do you look?
I feel like I'm talking so much.
No, it's perfect. Anyone that has anything to say is perfect. Thank you.
I would say for myself, and especially in working with clients, is kind of the whole thing we're talking about, that self-love. Like if I can't identify and know what I value in myself, then for me, it's hard to find that. Then we're constantly seeking in other people. And again, when you've experienced betrayal trauma, how I didn't always trust myself. So, but if I trust someone else who I don't really know that well, more than myself, I'm not really in a good space. So a lot of it is creating a foundation. And I work on I am statements with my clients, a lot of helping them know things to be true. A lot of times they work through, or maybe they don't necessarily know, but it's working to really believe who they are. And then also identifying these red flags and deal breakers, and then green flags and yellow flags. And some of that comes through the dating process, but sometimes I have to be my own accountability partner, or even to my client, I am their accountability partner to say, okay, this is what you said was a deal breaker. And now you're saying, because you really think he's super cute, that you're willing to bend that. And so let's go back to why you created that, is that was a deal breaker, and then reevaluate, is this person worth moving forward with, And so, but again, sometimes feeling like the options aren't out there, the sifting process is exhausting. And certainly I bet you all can nod that it is, you have to have tough skin being in the dating, because even though you maybe don't want them, all of a sudden it becomes really personal when they don't want to talk to you either, and we want to know why, and what did we do, when really, as we were talking about, attraction is the number one thing. So it's either there or it's not. And it's just kind of how it goes.
Yeah. What do you say to your clients? What does recovery look like? I'm right here and I'm enthralled in addiction. What will recovery look like for me? You said vulnerability and honesty. You can expand on that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the first thing I look for when I'm working with couples is their communication styles. It's one of the most interesting things. Most of them come in under extreme duress. And so it's interesting to see the control talk and the reactive listening that goes on. And even these subtle jabs and whatnot, you can tell real close who's working and who's not. You got one search talker who's kind of reflectively listening, but the other one's very defensive and reactively listening. Just by the opening conversation I have with them, you can kind of tell who's working and who's not. And so it's getting them into that I don't know, that degree of communication by which they can ask questions and teach each other what's working and what's not working, instead of trying to pick apart one another and see who's stronger and who can stay in the corner the longest while they're getting sucker punched. I've noticed that there's a lot of humility that comes into this. What I've really stressed with my athletes and my clients alike is that you have to allow yourself to become emotionally vulnerable, and that's a very scary thing, specifically when you look at what's at stake. I don't know about the rest of the therapists in here, but for me, when I get people in, they're way past usually what I can help them with. They don't come in to get counseling until it's like the bitter end. And so, I would say that one of the strongest things you guys can do is, like you said, check in those dailies. I think there's something you need to do every day to be able to maintain that relationship, that if you ignore or if you put off to the side, you will slip. I saw that you posted my acronym for a relapse, right? We don't talk about relapse unless you are full blown back into it. If you have a slip, an acronym for sobriety's lost its purpose, well, then we have to reestablish what that purpose is. What is the purpose of even trying to strengthen this marriage or even regain the balance in it? If you don't have a purpose in it, then there's no sense in even trying. Like you've got to have a degree of why you're doing this, and then move on from there. But just from the opening conversations, I can tell who, who's working and who's not.
Oh, that's good. Yes, Holly.
I mean, I was blessed, right, to be single in my late 30s, right? Not, not by choice, but it is hard, and it's hard out there. Really, it's hard to say when we're in full recovery, right? Because recovery can take years and years and years, but have we done enough recovery, right? To know ourselves, to me, it really helped to know my values of what was important. And most people, it didn't last more than a few weeks, because those red flags are pretty big flying at this age, I feel like. But as we got to know the things I was looking for, when you said, how do you know, right? You're looking for honesty, transparency, accountability, that proactiveness and that consistency, right? I can show up one day, but can I show up for months at a time, right? Can I, and I think that's one of the biggest things. You can really feel recovery. You can feel it because it's lived. They're setting their own boundaries. They're transparent. There's so many great things that once you know what you're looking for are really helpful when you're dating.
Oh, that's so good.
I had a long list because I feel like I've always thought of an individual's journey of healing kind of their own, but there are certainly things that are common to the healing process, and especially with particularly to trauma and addiction. And so maybe I won't go over like the whole list, but it occurred to me maybe just sharing, what has been maybe one of the most valuable things of my journey and of those that I work with is just knowledge and truth, I think is maybe one of the things that so education, basically, really good, solid education.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just being able to understand the the truth about like what is addiction and where does it come from, and and how do we heal, and the same thing with understanding betrayal trauma. It was for me, and what I think has been valuable to share in the healing process for others is again, for me, like the truth about what is it really, and the school of thought of trauma itself was a huge part of my healing. So going from maybe older views or some of the original views about family members and addiction to, the trauma lens is much newer than some of the other models. And I know that learning, understanding myself and the trauma response, and understanding like safety seeking and other things, and then and then the truth about addiction itself, so that you're not internalizing or self-blaming for someone else's addiction or choices. And then like it was shared earlier, I think just being able to move from wanting to being so motivated to heal, to save, my family or my marriage, and then ultimately moving to healing and potentially saving myself, if that makes sense. And so so there's so much, but I felt like that was maybe one thing I could chime in. So.
The first step is truth. And Marnie touched on it. From what I understand, some of the behaviors of addiction might be that it's their lifeline, right? If you are trying to help them to get over this addiction because it's not working for your marriage, then you're going to be considered the assassin. And so all of their behaviors would reflect that. And that's where a lot of the triggering comes up. And what Marnie explained is the gaslighting. And it's because, and I would always say, it's not the person, it's not this evil person that you're married to, but it's that addiction that's trying to hang on to that lifeline. And the behaviors come with that. Thank you guys, all of you
Awesome.
for being here and all that you shared. And if we have any other questions, we'll for sure direct them to the right people that they want.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Thanks. Good meeting you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.